there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger happy? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And the rest of the world noticed.
Let's look at the signs of Western decline. You got higher property prices. This happened throughout the Western world. Inflation and lower quality of life. Higher stock market valuations, which means greater inequality. Less real economic growth, less and less people are doing real jobs. Euthanasia for the poor, just killing off the poor people. Mass immigration, population replacement. Lower birth rate, greater public and private debt, bureaucratic gaslighting. When the government no longer acknowledges problems, it just lies to you directly. And privatization, asset stripping, okay? So all this is happening in the Western world. The question now is, why would this happen? And there are different theories, okay? And we'll go over some of the major theories. There's lots and lots of theories. We'll go over the major ones. And there's going to be overlap between these theories. And some of these theories make a lot of sense, okay? So one major theory is the idea of neoliberalism. The idea of neoliberalism is the belief that all that matters in society, all that matters in life is economic growth. If your society can generate more economic growth, all problems will be solved. Okay? So if your economy runs really fast, then everyone will be happy. That's the idea of neoliberalism. Then you have techno-feudalism, which is the idea that some big corporations, usually these tech companies, they want to control the world. And so they want to turn everyone into slaves. And if you don't have a house, you don't have your own property, then you can be controlled by these companies. Okay? Techno-feudalism. World government, where the United Nations has this conspiracy to control the entire world, to destroy national sovereignty and create a world unified government, okay? Population replacement theory. And the idea here is that the problem for governments in the Western world is that white people are opinionated. They believe in democracy. They believe in freedom. And they're hard to control. So let's replace the white people with Chinese and Indians and Filipinos, because Asian people are more obedient, right? That's the idea. And again, these are just theories. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. Okay. And we'll go into these theories later on semester. Now, the last reason is bureaucratic incompetence. The government is just stupid. Okay. Now, there's some overlap among these theories, and there's some validity to all these theories.
We all know that the Western democracy, its main agenda or its main goal was always to bully and destroy everything that they consider weaker countries that came in front of them. This we know very well. That is spearheaded by Trump of the United States. It is the head of what we call empirical overreach. Brothers and sisters, the Western interference has been a big issue. The Western interference has been a big issue that has been discussed by different professors. In today's lecture, we are going to see a video by Professor Kishore Mahbubani, or Kishore Mahbubani. Is an Indian American professor who dissects how the West sleepwalked into its own downfall. So while they are thinking that they are doing better, while they are thinking that they will continue bullying other countries, they'll continue doing all these things, they are walking into their own downfall. We call it death trap. We are seeing today the United States crumbling. Yes, because the world has seen them for who they are. The world has seen the West for what it is. And somehow, people are starting to distance themselves from this. People are finding the alternative, and they are saying, so the US is not the sovereign that we used to see. The bullying and everything that they ever did, that's the language that they understand. But in today's video, brothers and sisters, we are going to see the truth being dissected. I hope we all get to learn from this video. I hope it makes sense that from what we are seeing, indeed, we are envisioning the fall of America, or generally the West. because it has been a menace for the problem for the longest time. It has been a problem for the longest time. So it is time people get to learn the truth. Brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video, and then I'll be back with my thoughts and commentaries in regards to this. So let's watch the video.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time at the How the Light Gets In festival and my first speech. So you can see I'm very nervous. But anyway, as you know, in the West, especially in Americans and British, you start the talk, you make a joke. I come from Asia, and in Asia, we always begin with an apology. But this is actually a genuine apology. And I sincerely want to apologize to you all if my talk makes you feel uncomfortable. And the problem here is that if I don't make you uncomfortable, and if I don't take you out of your comfort zones, you won't understand the world that's coming. The world that is coming is so far outside your comfort zones that you really got to, in a sense, suffer a bit of pain if you're going to understand it. So the way I propose to organize my remarks today is to try and give you a glimpse of the new world that's emerging. And I'll talk in the first part about how we are seeing, firstly, of course, the end of the era of Western domination of world history. The West has had a very good run. 200 years plus of global domination, which is fun. But that's over. And it's important to understand why it's over. What happened? What did the West do wrong? And then the second part about basically what you're seeing is a new multi-civilizational world where you're seeing the return of other civilizations. And that's, of course, going to change the texture and chemistry of our world significantly. And I'm going to focus, although, in that section mostly on China, because China is now the leading edge of new world. And if you don't understand China, you don't understand new world is coming, right? And then I'm going to talk about what you might see, therefore, as we move into this new world, what kind of scenarios can we expect? How will we stumble into this new world that's coming? So let me then begin by talking about why the West has lost its way. And I want to just begin by making a slightly provocative statement that the West has, in global terms, become a lonely, narcissistic civilization, self-absorbed in itself, very happy with itself. And therefore, with this narcissism, has blinded itself to the mistakes that it has made in dealing with the rest of the world. And I want to begin the story in some ways with the end of the Cold War in 1990. Because I'm sure you all remember how the West celebrated, how happy the West was that it defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. And the West thought, hey, we have arrived. And you even believed. This is amazing. Almost everyone in the West believed that you had reached the end of history. Hooray! We don't have to struggle anymore. We've made it. We made it to the top. We've achieved these liberal democratic societies, which are the best societies in the world. We succeeded. We've made it. The rest of you, the rest of the world, you got to struggle. We don't have to struggle. And one statistic that I'm surprised that so few in the West are aware of is that the West only makes up 12% of the world's population. 12%. 88% lives outside the West. And the West crazily assumed at that moment of history, when it reached the end of history, that the rest of the West would come and become replicas of the West. Copy you, follow you, and become like you. I'm sure you'll all agree that that's a somewhat arrogant assumption on the part of the West. But that arrogance dominated the worldview of all the Western intellectuals at that time. I know it so well because by an accident of history, I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92, and I drowned in that arrogance that I could feel about how the West had arrived and succeeded, and the rest of you poor chaps, get used to it, adjust to it, move on. So the reason why that arrogance at that point was a major strategic mistake, because that arrogance put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the other civilization decide to wake up. So you close your eyes when the rest of the world was waking up. And remember, China had started its 4 modernizations program in 1979, and by 1989, 1990 was gaining a lot of momentum. And then India also woke up around the early 1990s. As a result of crisis, by the way, in both cases, China went through major crisis and said, okay, enough is enough, time for us to get sensible and do the right thing. India went through major crisis and said, enough is enough, let's do the right thing. And of course, what you've seen since then, in the case of the Chinese civilization has been around for 4,000 years. And the last 40 years of economic and social development in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. And the West said, cannot be. They're not like us. They cannot be succeeding, right? Because you assume to succeed, you must be liberal democratic. So that clearly, that's why I think the end of the history moment was a disastrous moment for the West, because it put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the rest was waking up. But there was another major strategic mistake that the West made once it felt that, okay, we're number one, we can run the world, we can do what we want to do. And of course, the many in the West believe that the most peaceful, law-abiding civilization in the world is Western civilization. But if you look at the data, the West became trigger happy and started getting involved in wars after wars. The last 30 over years, the West decided that the best way to spread liberty is to bomb cities. Bombing is the best way to spread democracy and liberalism. And the rest of the world noticed that this happened, that you had become trigger happy. Of course, it started in the late 1990s, when of course you thought you were doing the right thing, you're trying to protect the people of the former Yugoslavia, and the way you do that is by bombing Belgrade. And incidentally, curiously, many in the West believe that the West, of course, always abides by international law. The bombing of Belgrade was a violation of international law. International law makes it very clear. This is Western international law. 1945 UN rules-based order, Western international law, that says that the use of force is justified when it's either an act of self-defense or if it's authorized by the UN Security Council. the bombing of Belgrade was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by the UN Security Council, and therefore illegal. And it's interesting because the West always believes in the rule of law. But I can tell you, when a Western prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia tried just to say, should we ask the question whether the bombing of Belgrade was legal or illegal, the amount of pressure put on that prosecutor was phenomenal. Again, many in the West didn't notice this, but the rest of the world noticed this. And that, of course, that trigger-happy strain didn't stop at Yugoslavia. It carried on with the Iraq War in 2003. And clearly, that war was illegal. It was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by UN Security Council. And by the way, I know perfectly well it wasn't authorized by the UN Security Council because I was a member of the UN Security Council myself, personally, for 2 years. I watched the debates, and I watched whether or not the United States and UK pushing very hard to get the rest of the world to agree the time had come to remove Saddam Hussein. The rest of the world said, no, this is not legal. And by the way, curiously, one interesting thing about the Iraq War that is worth noting and remembering is that two of the best friends of the United States and the United Kingdom, two countries called France and Germany, actually opposed the war and did say to US and UK, this is the mistake, don't do this is the mistake. And of course, they were shoved aside because there was total conviction that what the US was doing in spreading democracy was the right thing. What stunned me, by the way, sometimes little stories that give you an indication of how people think. I thought that this desire for war was probably limited to a tribe that's called the neocons in America, by the way, who always believe that the best solution is American military intervention. But I happened to be in New York in 2002, attending a wonderful lunch in a very exclusive club in New York. And I was sitting next to a very successful American businessman. And as we were sat down for lunch, we were being served wine. And when the waiter came to pour wine, this gentleman asked the waiter, is this French wine? The waiter said, yes. He said, I'm not touching French wine. They're opposing our war in Iraq. That, to me, was a huge wake-up call. Gosh, this desire for war is so deep, so entrenched in the West. But Iraq war, as you know, was not the last war. There could have been lessons learned. War crimes were committed in Iraq. And at the same time, subsequently, when you intervene in Libya, right, that was also a major war crime. I mean, Gaddafi was a dictator. Let's be clear about that. There's no doubt that he was a dictator. But under him, the Libyan people had the best lives of anybody in Africa. They had guaranteed income, guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed education, guaranteed peace. They had good lives. And then you bombed Gaddafi, the country collapsed, the West created a failed state, and just walked away. And the rest of the world noticed. So, I mean, there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger-happy after the end of the Cold War? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And of course, the third strategic mistake that the West made was to continue to try and dominate the world. I think most ordinary citizens in the West are not aware of what your leaders, what your diplomats are trying to do in trying to preserve Western control of the world. And in often using methods and principles that in theory go against Western principles. Okay? I mean, for example, you believe in meritocracy. You believe that if anyone should be chosen to run an organization, it should be the best possible person. It doesn't matter whether he's white or black or Asian or African. Doesn't matter. If he's the best person, we pick him, right? Now, two of the world's most important international economic organizations are the IMF and the World Bank. In theory, they serve the world. So anybody in the world should qualify to run the IMF and the World Bank. And I can tell you, at one moment when the West felt very vulnerable, at the height of the 2008 financial crisis, when people in the US and Europe began to think, what's happening to us, what's happening to us? When you suddenly needed the rest of the world to come together to save the world economy, you had a G20 meeting in the UK chaired by Gordon Brown, and you said at that meeting, from now on, the leaders of IMF and the World Bank must be chosen on merit. 2008 is 18 years ago. 18 years have passed. Even now, to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And 88% of the world's population don't qualify to run a world's institution. Now, that is so unwise. So unwise. These are supposed to be global institutions. Why do you insist that only Westerners can run it? Why do you say only 12% of the world can run the world's institutions? Clearly, these are decisions made by your leaders. And all these decisions will come to haunt you as the world changes now.
I think it's going off the cliff. I'm sorry to say this, but I think what we will witness in our lifetime is the fall of the West. And if you just read some history, Oswald Spengler, but even read the great religious traditions and their eschatologies, whether it's Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, Orthodox, it doesn't really matter. But they all talk about how when a society declines, there are certain signs that is in decline. And the West right now has all these signs, okay? So one major sign is the demographic crisis, where the population is aging drastically, and young people refuse to have children. So what do? They bring in immigrants. And what do these immigrants do? They clash culturally with the local population. This is exactly what we're seeing in the West right now, where you have these baby boomers who refuse to die, and they've absorbed all the resources. They have all the political power. And young people refuse to engage in the economy. They refuse to have children, and they bring in like these millions of immigrants, both legally for the HB1 system and illegally. But it's causing tremendous social rife throughout society. And unfortunately, this is just a sign of a society in decline. That's sign number one, demographic crisis. Second is financialization, meaning that the society no longer produces anything. It just gambles, it speculates. And young people just fall into crushing debt. So think of all these young people in America right now that have, student loans that they can never ever get rid of. You can't declare bankruptcy on student loans. You think about credit card debt. 50% of Americans don't have access to $500 for an emergency. But so financialization, that's sign number two. Sign number three is moral decay, where there's really no sense of right and wrong anymore in Western society. It's all about profit. It's all about following the rules. It's like people aren't allowed to exercise their common sense anymore. You have this massive dictatorship going on. I just read today that there were two Americans, Cenk Uygur, Hassan Paika. I'm sure you know who they are, but they were denied entry to Britain because they were a threat to the public peace. What does that mean, really, to a threat to the public peace? But you're not even allowed to speak your mind anymore. And it's all part of this moral decay when people are not even allowed to have an honest conversation. And then you have another sign, which is just evil triumphs in the world. So the more evil you are, the more powerful you become. So just think about how these incompetent individuals, people like Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos, just by co-opting political system, they're able to just have billions and billions of dollars. I think just the idea of billionaires is outrageous. And never before in history have we had so many billionaires. Basically, in America, 10 billionaires have as much money as the bottom 50% of the population. That's just astonishing to think about. One hedge fund manager in America makes more in a year than all kindergarten teachers combined in America. So I think that the situation really is hopeless. I mean, I don't. I don't know how to explain this to people, but historically, you just look at humanity, human history for thousands of years. This is a this is a very typical cycle. Societies do decline over time, and we're seeing these radical symptoms of that. And there's really nothing people can do about it right now. Red is where the population, the society has an above replacement fertility rate. Okay, so above 2.1. If it's dark red, like here in the middle of Africa, it's 6 to 7 or 6 above. Okay, and why is it that the case? Because Africa is in a situation where it's a growing society with middling tech, so a lot of people die, lots of competition. So to survive, families have to give birth to a lot of kids. Okay, they have no choice in the matter. But then you move to the rest of the world. Okay, so this is North America, Europe, and East Asia, the 3 wealthiest parts of the world. And guess what? The fertility rate is collapsing because now we've entered the end game where it is overpopulation, too much wealth, so too much inequality. And so women are forced to pick the best possible mate or not have children at all. All right? And here the situation is very, very dire. North America and Europe are kind of okay. Why? Because of immigration. Because even though their women are not having children, they can choose to import people for their labor force. But East Asia is really, really screwed, guys, okay? So just look at this region. Okay, so China is 1, but the worst is South Korea. South Korea has the lowest population the lowest fertility rate in the world. They're at between 0.6 to 0.8. So they're probably gone in 50 years' time. It's so bad that when you go to South Korea, there are signs outside restaurants that says no dogs and no kids. They think that kids are a problem.
I think what we're seeing is a long-term trend. Actually that is a decline of Western hegemony, or an end of Western hegemony, which one can date already back to the end of World War II, when most of Europe lost its colonies around the world. The United States, in a way, replaced the European empires to become an American empire. It competed with the Soviet Union as the 2 major imperial powers, but the U.S. was within that competition in some way always dominant economically and technologically. Though it was a very frightening time because these were 2 nuclear superpowers that were at each other's throats, often at least in proxy wars. When the Soviet Union dissolved or disintegrated in 1991, it looked to the U.S. leadership and to much of the world that the U.S. was the sole superpower and was completely dominant. But I would say the long-term trend that had led to the decline overall of Western power after World War II was continuing. What happened at the end of World War II with the end of the European imperial age was that the rest of the world, and especially in Asia, was given new space for catching up technologically, catching up in terms of education levels, literacy, urbanization, industrialization. And so all the way back from the end of World War II on, there was a narrowing of the gap between the industrialized West which broadly speaking was Europe and the United States, and the countries of Asia, and at least some partial economic development success stories in other parts of the world as well.
So I know that Beijing, when I was working as a high school administrator, and he bought an entire duffel bag